Hello, everyone. Welcome once again to the continual reading of The Magic of Life by Robert Young. It's a great honor to read this book. And now I continue on chapter 29. Henry had no idea what was happening when Simon had called earlier and pulled him away from his beloved Mary. He thought this had probably been set up so Mary and Willem could be together. But Henry felt a little put out because he really had wanted to be with both of them. They had all enjoyed such a beautiful afternoon and had gotten along so well. Simon was in a bit of a flap, and that did not fit well with Henry's special feelings at that time. Henry was very careful when he felt his mood start to change and became angry at the disturbance. He quickly saw what was happening and stepped back to take a deep breath and spoke to Simon slowly and clearly. "Simon, do you really need me at this time? I want you to think about it, and I want you to calm down and tell me, is it me you need, or do you only need to tell me you've got problems?" asked Henry. Simon stopped and thought for a while, but the silence over the phone helped him see everything with clarity as Henry waited. Simon answered very slowly, "Henry, I'll be honest. I don't know how to handle what's just happened. There are two ships that have been forced to take shelter on our island. There seems to be bad weather coming, and we have 600 people to look after. I know we can house them, but I don't know who to get to organize them. Our staff could handle about 200, but with 600, we're in a bit of trouble. So I don't need another set of hands. I need 400 sets of hands." Henry laughed and said, "Simon, that's why you're a manager. Even though I own the place, I at least used to work there. So yes, I can help you. I'll be there shortly." As he entered the plaza, Henry remembered very clearly that he had done so well. It was the first time he could remember not being upset with Simon and with having to leave Mary, and he was more than pleased with himself about the way he handled everything. When he discovered the extent of the problem, he knew that he was the only one who could deal with it. Henry slipped into a comfortable mode where his capabilities shone from his face. Mary had noticed that before he left, and she made comment on it. She had said, "Henry, you'd be lost without this place. It needs you, but you also need it. It makes you glow." Henry felt good after hearing Mary's comments, and he noticed that when he had given her a hug, everything felt like it had changed. He realized he loved Mary deeply with every part of his being. Mary obviously felt this and responded. She actually walked with Henry every step on his travels back to the main plaza. As Henry walked through the foyer and saw the people streaming in through all the doors, he knew that what Mary had said was correct. He could feel that special feeling rise inside him, and he knew with every step he became taller. As he walked in amongst the people and headed towards the reception desk of the main plaza, all eyes turned to Henry. The eyes of the staff lit up and smiles came to their faces. People standing there who had never met Henry before knew that he was there to provide a solution to their problem. They had all experienced a harrowing trip through seas that were not at all friendly and with people who were not very courteous. When people had turned up to the hotels with so many other people, they did not think it was going to be possible to get any sleep that night. Henry knew exactly what to do. He did not go behind the counter. Instead, he walked around and spoke quietly to the people and asked them what their needs were. He provided quick and easy solutions to everything they requested, and he ushered people over to the desk, one after the other, stating the type of room they required and where it should be, what facilities were needed, and what notes should be placed on their book. Henry ordered his staff to Please put a note on the book for me so I can attend to these people's needs as soon as I'm finished allocating the rooms. Make sure I know of the whereabouts of their entire luggage and make an appointment for me to see these people at a convenient time. This also applied to those who did not have their belongings there with them. Henry knew every corridor of the hotels and of the plaza, and he knew every back alley to get from one place to another. He knew who to place where based on their needs, and he knew what time to tell each person to turn up for meals and where to go. Even without the use of a computer, Henry knew that he would not overload any of the facilities in any part of the plaza. He set times for people straight off the top of his head: time to shower, time to eat, time to go to bed, time to shop. His suggestions to each person were different, and he knew that they would follow his suggestions, and he knew that he had total control over what happened in the hotel. He also noticed that the winds were getting stronger, and as he worked away, he would slip outside to feel what was happening with the weather. After a while, he knew that if people opened the doors on the western end of the hotel too, they were likely to lift off the roof. He could feel the building strain, and the people could feel it too. He reassured them that it had been designed to withstand anything that nature could deliver. He said these things with such confidence that people felt comfortable, but Henry knew that he had to be careful. He knew that nature was much more powerful than any building, and he knew that precautions were extremely important. So when he gave instructions for the security system to shut the doors that may cause them problems, he said it in a way so that nobody would suspect a thing. He then quietly directed a porter to find the maintenance man and bar the door so that it could not be opened under any circumstance. Henry also organized many of the windows on the other floors to be locked. He did all this while in the middle of handling the deployment of 600 people. It was with ease that Henry handled these things, but at the same time, he dearly missed the contact with Mary, and so as soon as he got a chance, he picked up the phone to ring her. Henry found no answer, but in many ways, he was not at all surprised. He knew that there would be some parts of the communication system that may suffer under these types of stormy and lightning conditions. He had been told about the possibility of these failures, but he had taken no notice because he thought it was just as easy to walk the few kilometers that it took to go from one end of Norwalk to the other. The communication to the power station was also in question because there were various parts that needed renewing, and Henry thought it was unnecessary. When the communication system did fail, Henry was not certain that there was another way to contact Mary. He made more phone calls to various areas and found that outside the plaza, all communications had ceased. He wondered whether anything should be done, but as the storm grew, he knew its intensity was not yet at its maximum. He decided that he must do something about the communications, and with a sudden determination, he said to himself, "The communications must be fixed now." He had no understanding of the size of the task, but he had determined that it should be done. Henry picked up the telephone there and then and called his dear friend Andrew. Andrew Kelly was a technician who had originated from Ireland. He was a very wiry man who thought the world of Henry, and he was a man with strength and a determination that could only be handled by Henry. So when Andrew picked up the phone and heard Henry's voice at the other end, he felt proud of the fact that Henry needed to call him. "Andrew, we have a problem," said Henry immediately. "So what would you like me to do?" asked Andrew. "The communication systems have failed," explained Henry. "What do you mean, Henry?" asked Andrew as he nearly jumped through the phone. It felt it was an insult to tell him that his system had failed. "I'm having trouble contacting people outside the plaza," answered Henry. "But the communication system is working. I'm talking to you on the phone now," said Andrew. Henry quickly cut Andrew off and said, "I need to talk to Mary. I need to talk to the power station, and I need to talk to the people outside the plaza. We have a major storm heading our way, which could easily turn into a cyclone. And without that communication, we're going to have huge problems. I told you about these things, said Andrew. Henry stopped him there immediately and said, I know, I'm totally wrong, but right now I need communication, and I'm relying on you. Andrew's chest puffed out because Henry never relied on anybody. Andrew took the opportunity and said reassuringly, Henry, you can count on me. Everything went quiet, and Henry waited, but the silence continued until suddenly he asked, Andrew, are you still there? Sorry, Henry, just weighing up the situation. How do a couple of hours sound to you? Asked Andrew. That might be too long, said Henry. I thought that might be the case, said Andrew. All our systems have 100% backup, and I don't understand how we could be totally down in all areas. It may be cabling, but to get new or temporary cabling across to where I think may be the problem could take a couple of hours. Take whoever you need. It must be done, said Henry. So is 2 hours too long? Asked Andrew. Yes, it is, answered Henry. Okay, leave it with me. I'll get back to you, said Andrew, and hung up immediately. Henry was not expecting the phone to go dead straight away, and the sudden silence and the clunk of the phone surprised him. He moved away from the phone, and for a fraction of a second he wondered where he was. He then took hold of the situation again and looked up and saw the people becoming agitated once more. Because Henry had moved his focus away and the storm was brewing outside, people could feel it. Henry moved away from the phone and walked into the center of the foyer where he raised his hands. It was like magic as everyone looked around, and without a word, Henry commanded a silence. The silence was such that he could hear his own breath. Everybody went quiet, and Henry began his spiel about the plaza and its policies, about how it was built by his father and the tradition that had been carried on over many years, and how everybody will be looked after better than they would be in any other circumstance. He talked about how everything would be provided to meet the people's needs, and of how there was nothing to be done by them regarding gathering their belongings. That was all being taken care of by the plaza, and that if anybody had any problems at all, he would be willing to talk to them personally to resolve those problems. If there was anything that they needed that could not be provided over the next couple of hours, they would have it provided by the hotel free of charge. As Henry came to the end of his spiel, he said with confidence, if there's anybody here right now who needs to talk to me to clarify anything I've said or to clarify their own position, please step forward now. People started to look around at one another, and a slight murmur went through the crowd before stopping. Nobody came forward, but one or two people started to move away and head towards their rooms. Then a few more followed, and a few more until everybody started to move away towards their rooms. Within a few minutes, a mere 10 people occupied the foyer, which had been full of people. Henry walked straight over to those people and asked if there was anything at all he could do, and was there anything he could provide for them, or was there any confusion that he could sort out for them. Many of them said there were no problems. They were just having a chat, while others commended Henry on his performance and on his attention. It was not too long before the foyer was empty. Henry stood and looked across toward the reception desk, where all of the staff were standing. And amongst the staff stood the figure of Simon Phillips, who, with a slight smile on his face, was looking directly at Henry. He was shaking his head from side to side as if to say, I can't believe it. Henry felt the admiration that was coming from Simon as he walked towards the counter. When Henry was within 2 steps of the counter, all of the staff started to clap and cheer. Simon stepped forward with a hearty handshake and a big pat on the back for Henry. There was laughter and joy, the sort that Henry was used to, and the kind of elation that he lived for. Within a few seconds, everybody was happy and back to normal. Henry announced, all right, let's get to it. We've got a few things to do and make sure all of those notes you've taken for each and every person are carried out. I don't care if none of us get any sleep tonight. We've got a big job to do." The response from the staff was unbelievable. Simon had tried so hard to get everyone on side, and yet here was Henry, who had walked in from nowhere, getting them all to do as he had requested without objection. They all loved him. Simon knew his place, and he knew his position as manager. He knew Henry's position with people also, and just shook his head and walked back to his office. Henry was not finished by a long shot. He had much to do, and he busied himself in the tasks that he had stored in his head. In fact, as he went about his task, he realized that he knew what he had said. He did not have to store the information, it sort of stored itself. He did not have to remember, as it was like walking along while ticking things off. He was quite amazed at how he managed to do that and how they had taught him to remember. When he spoke to Andrew again, Andrew became quite serious. Henry was not at all surprised. "Henry, there's only one way we can do this. We'll have to radio link to the power station and feed everything back from there," said Andrew. "The beach has disappeared, and where we laid our cables to hide the overhead lines, they've all been dragged into the sea. So we've lost about 15 kilometers of cable. The rest of the link is fine, but the power station is able to talk to everyone. This part of the town is out, though, and the only reason the plaza is working is because it has its own exchange." "That's great," said Henry. "So how do we radio link it?" "It's a little difficult. The radios we need are the radios they use on the fishing boats, and most of the fishing boats are around the other side of the island. It's going to be almost impossible to get to them by sea, and to go over the top the way we normally do would be a little bit hairy," said Andrew. "Andrew, where are you now?" asked Henry. "I'm in the basement in my little workshop," answered Andrew. "The one that you won't even let me visit?" asked Henry. "That's right, but today you've got the key." "I'd better see you straight away," said Andrew. Henry laughed and said, "Andrew, I've always had the key. I've just respected the fact that you didn't want me down there." Andrew laughed too and added, "Well, I didn't think I'd be able to put one over on you, but it felt good anyway. I guess I'll see you there. I'll see you here soon then." With that, Henry walked to the elevator and headed down to the basement. Andrew's little room, as he called it, was monstrous. It was almost the size of the basement car park, and it was so full of equipment. Henry wondered how it had all been brought into the place. When he shook hands with Andrew, he felt good. They were a good team, and they liked to work together. "Okay, Andrew, I can get you to the other side of the island, but how do we get hold of the radios?" asked Henry, while getting down to business. "I have to go because I know exactly what I need, and I know there are 2 base stations that I've lent to Willie and John in exchange for special deliveries whenever we ask for it," explained Andrew. "Do you think they'll be okay about handing the equipment back?" asked Henry. "There's no doubt that we can have that equipment whenever we need it. That was one of the conditions, and if I could contact them, they would deliver it here right now. They won't give it to anyone else, though. They've promised me that, so that's why I have to go, but I don't know that I can get there over the top. Is there another way, Henry?" "It sounds like you know some other way," asked Andrew. Henry laughed and said, "Of course I do. How do you think I get to my special place at Joseph's Hill? Do you think I walk around the top? No way. It's a bit rough out there, Andrew, but I can take you there. Are you willing to take it on?" Andrew thought for a moment, then answered, "Would I ever object? I love a challenge, and I'd love to have you along with me, Henry." They shook hands before Henry said, "Let's go. We'll need some fairly substantial clothing, wet weather gear, reasonable boots, and the most important item of all, a backpack. I have a special backpack, said Henry, but I can't afford the time to go looking for it. Andrew put his hand up to stop Henry and said, "Come with me." Andrew led the way out of the door and down the corridor of the basement and into another room where the plaza's spare linen was stored. Also stored in there, in a large wardrobe of one end of the room, was as much wet weather gear as you could imagine, with backpacks, boots, everything. Henry shook his head in amazement and said to Andrew, "I knew you were well set up, but this is really, really set up." "No questions, Henry. Just get the gear you want and we'll be underway," said Andrew. Henry donned his clothes and even found a pair of boots exactly the same as his favorite pair and a backpack almost the same as well. It was filled with nearly the same equipment, and it looked at Andrew as he checked out the backpack and said, "How come it's almost the same as mine?" "Everything around here is almost the same as yours, Henry. That's how we know what to do," answered Andrew. Henry laughed, and he felt good about everything that was happening at the moment. He threw his arm around Andrew's shoulder and said, "Okay, let's go." Henry and Andrew headed off and took the elevator up to the ground floor. Henry knew that it was important that he stay in contact with everyone, and he knew there was a lot of work to be done. He also knew they would be away for at least 2 hours, so he said to Andrew, "Andrew, we can't be away for 2 hours. We have to be faster than that. If we wander along the normal way, it will take that amount of time. We've got to half that." "How far have we got to go?" asked Andrew. "I think around 10 kilometers each way," said Henry. "No way, we can't do that," replied Andrew while shaking his head. Henry stood for a while and bit his lip. "I'm not sure of the distance, but I know we can do it. Come on, let's go." As they passed the reception desk, everyone turned and looked at them. They were all wondering what Henry and Andrew were up to, but no one said a word. No one ever questioned Henry, and most certainly no one ever questioned Andrew. They all looked at each other, but said nothing. Henry turned quickly as he passed the counter and reassured them. "We're off to get some radios. We'll be out of contact for at least an hour or maybe a little longer. We'll be back as soon as we can, and we'll get our communication system working again. See you soon." The main attendant behind the desk saluted Henry just as he always did. In return, Henry gave him the thumbs up before heading out into the darkness and the swirling winds. The winds were cleaning up the streets and tearing things apart throughout the town. Andrew walked briskly with the wind slashing around his face and tearing at his clothes, while Henry moved slowly into his long stride. He looked rather comfortable in the harsh conditions. The contrast was amazing. Andrew struggling and working hard, and Henry just moving with the elements and allowing his body to sway as he was buffeted by the winds. He was enjoying every moment of the walk. Andrew turned suddenly to Henry and shouted over the wind, "Okay, Henry, which way do we go?" "Just keep going towards the little park by my place. The entrance is at the rear of the park," shouted Henry. "Entrance? Entrance to what?" yelled Andrew. "I suppose you could call it an entrance to another world," replied Henry. "Just keep going and save your breath. We'll be there shortly." Henry did not want to talk much. He loved the wind and loved to walk along the outer parts of the island. He was looking forward to going back to where he had felt the change the previous day. He also very much needed to concentrate on his connection with Mary, and he wondered how she was going. He knew that the winds and the rain would affect her house as it did every time back when he was a child. He knew that it was not a good place to be outside during the heavy winds. He thought about Mary and then decided he would stay connected to her and get back out of the thought patterns and away from the problems of everybody's lives to just enjoy this task he had taken on. He decided to enjoy it as an outing and not a task. Henry knew that Andrew was very intense and that he would be working hard all of the time and that it was a challenge for him. Everything was a challenge to Andrew. His Irish background showed through as his face became redder as his hair, which has a tinge of ginger, not even red, started to glow. Andrew's face again turned a darker shade of red. Henry took no notice because he knew exactly what was happening with Andrew, and he knew that Andrew would fire himself up to a point where nothing would stop him. That was really what Henry had wanted at that moment, because he did not need the stress of Andrew, but he did need Andrew's assistance. Without Henry, Andrew would not have been able to carry on with the task that he had been given, and that was to make all of the communications normal in case the cyclone came through. As they approached the park, Henry motioned Andrew towards the rear of the park, and Andrew kept looking up at Henry, then looking back and wondering where they were going. As they reached the carving at the back of the park, it became obvious to Andrew where they were headed. He immediately turned left and walked straight towards the iron gate, but when he reached it, he found that he could not open it. Henry walked past him and stuck his hand through the gate and undid a hidden latch. The gate opened immediately with a large creak, and the squeaking sound echoed like it was in a chamber. Andrew shivered a little as he moved through the gate and felt Henry close behind him. It was dark and the area felt closed in. Andrew was not sure whether he was in a cave, but it was cold and the winds whistled straight through his clothes as if they were not even there. Henry knew the area very well and recognized the comfort of the cavern that they were now walking through. He knew that he only had to walk another few yards and they would be out of the strong winds. Henry led the way and Andrew close on his heels, and when he reached the point where he knew everything was comfortable, he slowed down and let Andrew catch up. It was actually quite warm now as they stood in the center of the cavern, and the sounds of the winds had almost disappeared. Henry put his arm around Andrew and said, "Just stand here and take this in for a moment. You'll feel yourself recover very quickly if you stand here quietly and listen." Andrew had no idea what Henry was talking about, and he wanted to continue stomping on, but he knew that Henry was in no mood for playing, so he took notice. To Andrew's surprise, within moments, his entire body started to settle down and became comfortable again. It was probably more comfortable now than it had been in the air conditioning of the hotel. He thought about it for a while and said, "No, the hotel is actually the most comfortable." Andrew could not understand why this sudden comfort seemed to come out of nowhere. It seemed to come out of the dark in the middle of a large cavern, although he had thought it was a cave. As he settled down, Henry explained, "This is the spot where most of the animals come to in big storms. So when you move on from here, Andrew, please be quiet and calm, and don't be surprised by what may appear in front of you. Just keep walking along as calmly and quietly as you possibly can." The hair stood up on Andrew's arms, and he felt a shiver run down his spine. He knew then why Henry was being so serious. He took notice immediately and sharpened the focus in his eyes and feelings. Henry placed his hand on Andrew's head and gave his hair a bit of a ruffle. "Come on, Andrew, just relax. Everything's fine," said Henry. "I didn't want to throw a scare into you, but the animals don't want to be scared either. They're not going to hurt anybody, but we also don't want to harm them. So just settle down and we'll walk a little slower for a while." Andrew nodded in agreement, but did not move. Henry grinned to himself and decided it would be best for him to take the lead. Henry strolled off at his normal pace, which Andrew thought was a little more than a stroll. Henry's long legs and his tall stature seemed to be visible in the darkness, and Andrew had no difficulty following the back of Henry's field, and he could feel that he was following closely behind Henry without even being able to see him. The darkness was amazing. They had brought torches with them, but Henry did not use his, so Andrew did not even venture towards taking his torch out of his pack. They moved on for about 15 minutes, and the calm of the cavern gradually started to disappear, and the winds started to lash around their heads again and whipped through the trees with a sound and a force that would attract anybody's attention. As they traveled along, the weather became more harsh and the rain became heavier and heavier. Andrew understood that they must have been moving out of the thick area of trees and moving into the open country. He was trying to fathom where they were physically, but could not get his bearings. He recognized the look of the island from the sea and from the view of the power station, but he did not recognize any part of the area they were walking through at this time. He was totally dependent on Henry's directions, and he had no idea of how far they had to walk. On the other hand, Henry knew exactly where he was. He knew that he was not far from the turnoff to Joseph's Hill, and he knew that at that turnoff he had to be extremely careful. It was here that the water rushing down the track from Joseph's Hill almost turned into a river at times. It was difficult to move along the sloped area without sliding down into the ravine, which led straight out to the ocean. As he moved along, he kept his ear to the ground and listened to the sounds of the ground rather than the sounds of the wind. He heard the trees crack, and he heard the animals move from their hiding places as they walked along. He could hear the water running, and he traced every rivulet in his mind until he knew that he was within probably 100 yards of the turnoff, and he stopped. "We need to tie ropes on," he said as he turned to Andrew. Andrew quickly gathered his senses. He knew exactly what Henry was talking about, as he was very experienced in rope work. He was also very experienced in climbing, and as soon as Henry said, "We need the ropes," Andrew's response was immediate, and off came the rope from his pack along with the clips, and he was clipped on to Henry within seconds. "What distance, Henry?" asked Andrew. 30 meters, answered Henry. Andrew measured out the distance and hooked himself that distance. He then held the rope in a coil as Henry moved off and pulled the rope from the coil. When it came close to the end, Andrew gave it a quick tug so that Henry knew that he was close to the end. They took up the tension and walked on. Henry moved slowly as he came to the waterway. He could hear the rush of the water, and he knew that it was well past the stage of the track. It had turned into a raging river. The river was more like a waterfall once it cut its way around the rocks. It was getting extremely hard to see, although as he got closer, the water became more visible. He knew that he would have to go upstream slightly to make an attempt to get across. As the water lapped over his boots, Henry started clambering up the hill, heading towards his beloved spot on Joseph's Hill, the spot where he loved to sit and spend time with his special friend, Simeon. It was at that point that his focus on Simeon made the difference. He realized then that Simeon was beside him and that he was being led further up the track than he would have expected. That special feeling he always experienced when Simeon was around was enough to lead him on as he followed up the path further and further than he expected to go, until suddenly he had the feeling to stop. Henry stopped and looked around, but he had no idea why he had stopped at that point. He waited until he got a real sense of what Simeon was trying to pass on to him. Suddenly, there was a lightning flash, and there, standing in front of Henry, was a very large tree right across the path. His heart filled with joy to think that he had been led to such a perfect crossing. It would not be easy with all of this wind, but it was a perfect crossing. He immediately turned and gave the rope 2 sharp pulls, and Andrew returned the pulls. Henry then started to reel in the rope, and Andrew followed slowly until they both met at the crossing. "Good one, Henry. Well done. You haven't lost your knack, have you?" said Andrew as he began reeling in the rope. Henry grinned and patted Andrew on the back. "Right, let's go, mate. We're on our way," he said. The two of them held hands to steady themselves and slowly walked across the large fallen tree. It seemed like all of the branches had been broken away to give them an easy passage, and when they reached the other side, it was like the steps had been made for them to get down off the tree. The tree had fallen between 2 very large rocks, and Henry and Andrew were able to step onto the rocks and then to another smaller rock before stepping down onto the ground. They both sat on the small rock and had a rest. The rain was dripping off their hats and running down their faces, and it was cold and windy, but inside they felt good. They felt that they had almost reached their destination. "We're not too far away now, are we, Henry?" asked Andrew. Henry replied, "No, this is the downhill run. We're on our way to the little township now, and we're not too far away. In this weather, it may be another 20 minutes. "Wow, I doubt if we'll be back in an hour then," said Andrew. Henry understood what Andrew was saying, but somewhere inside of him, he knew that he would meet the deadline, whatever that would be. The problem was, though, if you added up all of the time that they had spent so far, they were going to be away a lot longer than they had originally thought. Henry, knowing how the island worked at times, knew that if he needed to get back at a certain time, though, then it could possibly happen. He held that in his mind, and his heart told him he was correct. He turned to Andrew and said, "We'll be there on time, Andrew. Just don't worry too much about it." "Okay," said Andrew, and stood up quickly to lead the way. Henry followed for a few steps and then said to Andrew, "I think I'd better lead." "Fine, but it's funny walking behind you when I've always walked ahead of you," said Andrew. "That's good. It's about time you took your place," laughed Henry. Andrew snarled and gave a bit of a chuckle, and then they both laughed and enjoyed the humor of the moment. As they moved forward, the winds increased and the sounds of the sea came back to their ears. Henry knew they were in for a rougher time yet. As they moved from the trees, he pulled Andrew alongside him and pointed. "There's the town down there, Andrew. Where do Willie and John live?" Andrew felt good as he was now back in the lead again. He recognized the town, although he had never been this far back into the bush, but he knew exactly where to go. He took off immediately and allowed enough rope for Henry to feel as though he was following and that Andrew was pulling him along. Henry laughed at Andrew's need to be the leader, as his need to feel Henry behind him. So he went along with Andrew's little ploy and allowed himself to stay clipped to the rope until they got close to the town, where he flicked off the clip and left Andrew walking along without him. Andrew took about 3 steps before he stopped and turned and saw Henry standing still. He did not know what to do. He wondered what Henry was up to. He walked back to Henry and asked, "What is it, Henry? Why did you unclip?" Henry looked him straight in the eye and answered, "Andrew, I don't follow anyone." Andrew could see how serious Henry was, and at that moment he withdrew slightly into himself before coming back and said, "My apologies, Henry." "That's fine. Let's go," said Henry. It was important for Henry to hold his position because he knew that the remainder of the day would demand his authority, and he knew that Andrew would run from authority if it were not maintained. And so on they went until they found the little hut that Willie and John occupied. Well, I'll stop there. That's chapter 29. And when I return, we will start at chapter 30. I wish you a perfect life, perfect health, and a magic future. Thank you.